The Persian Gulf oil platform does not look like a military target. It looks like an industrial structure. A 100-meter lattice of steel and pipe and flare stack rising from the flat water on its 4 anchor legs, lit at night by the amber work lights of a facility that never stops running and the constant orange flame of the gas flare burning off excess pressure at the top of its tower. From a distance, in darkness, it resembles a small city that has wandered out to sea and anchored itself there, indifferent to the political geography surrounding it. The Foruzan platform complex sat at the northern edge of the offshore production zone that Iran and Saudi Arabia had jointly administered under various agreement frameworks for decades, in a position that placed it in the legal and operational gray zone that characterized so much of the Persian Gulf's contested maritime space. Its ownership was documented. Its status was disputed. Its daily production output of approximately 70,000 barrels of crude petroleum represented an economic reality that all parties to the dispute preferred to sustain rather than disrupt, which had made it, for 23 years, a facility that political tension circled without touching. At 11:51 p.m., that changed. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter assigned to the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, USS, positioned 7 nautical miles east of the platform, had been conducting a routine maritime security patrol orbit at 800 feet, when its radar operator registered a contact cluster appearing at the platform's western bearing that did not match any vessel on the current shipping deconfliction picture. The contacts were low, very low, approximately 40 feet above the water surface, and fast, moving at a speed the radar system characterized in its initial track computation as approximately 550 knots. Not boat speed, not aircraft speed in any conventional sense. The specific combination of altitude and velocity that belonged to one specific category of weapon: cruise missiles. A cluster of them, bearing from the Iranian coastline 29 nautical miles to the northwest, on a direct approach heading toward the platform's main processing module. The radar operator's transmission to the destroyer was 8 words and took 4 seconds. Strike, Nighthawk. Multiple fast movers, low altitude, bearing 285, inbound platform. The Combat Direction Center aboard the destroyer had been tracking the western approach corridor with its own Spy-1D radar since the patrol began, but the contacts the Seahawk was reporting had been below the SPY-1D's surface clutter filter, a known limitation of shipborne radar systems against sea-skimming missiles that exploited the electromagnetic boundary between the water's surface and the lower atmosphere to mask their approach profile until they were close enough that the geometry of their trajectory finally brought them above the filter threshold. The SPY-1D acquired the contacts at 11:51 p.m. and 44 seconds, when the contacts were 18 nautical miles from the platform and the closing geometry had elevated their apparent track above the clutter floor. 18 nautical miles. At 550 knots. Approximately 118 seconds of flight time to impact. The Combat Direction Center's engagement sequence initiated in the specific, compressed way that it initiates when the numbers do not allow deliberation. The commanding officer had 31 seconds of preparation before the engagement window opened to its effective maximum. 31 seconds in which the ship's systems were completing their own target acquisition and engagement solution computations, while the watch team ran the specific mental arithmetic that translated track data, weapon flight time, and system response time into the operational reality of how many contacts could be engaged before any of them reached the platform's hull. The answer to that arithmetic was not reassuring. The SPY-1D was tracking 6 contacts. 6 cruise missiles in a loose formation spread across a front approximately 4 nautical miles wide, flying their sea-skimming approach profile at 40 feet and 550 knots with the patient, mechanical certainty of weapons that have been given a target and have no function other than reaching it. The destroyer's standard missile SM-2 battery was the primary engagement system, a capable, operationally proven weapon with an engagement envelope that covered the threat altitude and the contact's incoming bearing. But the SM-2 engagement cycle had a physical reload time between shots that placed a hard ceiling on the number of contacts that a single ship could engage in the time available before the contacts reached the platform. The destroyer could engage 4 of the 6 contacts before their flight time expired. That left 2. The commanding officer made the engagement decision at 11:52 p.m. and 7 seconds. He assigned the SM-2 battery its 4-shot sequence, allocated the ship's Phalanx C IWS to autonomous engagement mode against any contact that survived into its terminal engagement range, and simultaneously transmitted the cruise missile attack warning to every vessel in the sector on the tactical net and to the CAOC at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. He also transmitted to the platform's crew on the emergency coordination frequency, a transmission that was 5 seconds long and consisted of a single instruction repeated twice. Get everyone inside hardened spaces now. The platform's offshore installation manager received the transmission at 11:52 p.m. and 14 seconds. He had been in the control room for a routine end-of-shift review. He activated the platform's emergency alarm without asking for clarification. 87 personnel were somewhere on the platform's decks, modules, and work areas at 11:52 p.m. The platform's muster stations were inside its 2 blast-rated accommodation modules, which had been designed and certified to withstand overpressure from hydrocarbon-related explosions rather than direct missile warhead detonation, but which were structurally the most protected spaces on a facility that had not been built with the expectation of being a military target. 87 people moving toward 2 muster stations in under 90 seconds. The first SM-2 launched at 11:52 p.m. and 19 seconds, its booster motor producing the bright column of fire that was the destroyer's most visible expression of what was happening on its tactical displays. The second followed at 11:52 p.m. and 28 seconds. Third at 11:52 p.m. and 38 seconds. Fourth at 11:52 p.m. and 49 seconds. Each missile climbing, accelerating, turning onto its intercept heading, guided by the Spy-1D's continuous track data through the geometry that connected its flight path to the contact's projected position. The Seahawk had repositioned during the engagement sequence. The MH-60R pilot had turned east immediately on his radar operator's first transmission, climbing away from the threat bearing with the instinct of an aircrew that understood the specific risk of occupying the same airspace as an inbound cruise missile salvo and an outbound SM-2 barrage simultaneously. At 11:52 p.m. and 30 seconds, he was at 1,800 feet, 6 nautical miles east of the platform, watching the engagement develop on his radar display with the particular quality of attention of someone who is out of the immediate danger zone and whose entire contribution to the next 60 seconds is to stay there and keep watching. What he was watching was a geometry problem resolving itself at the speed of weapons flight. The first SM-2 intercept occurred at 11:52 p.m. and 51 seconds, 23 nautical miles west of the platform, 40 feet above the Gulf surface, at a closing speed that made the engagement a question of microseconds of sensor discrimination and warhead timing. The contact disappeared from the SPY-1D's track picture. The Seahawk's radar registered the brief, bright return of a proximity warhead detonation and then resolved the surrounding space as empty. 1 down. Second intercept at 11:52 p.m. and 57 seconds. Third at 11:53 p.m. and 4 seconds. The engagements were happening faster than the watch team could fully process them individually. The Combat Direction Center's picture was updating with each intercept event, the track count reducing from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3, the flight times on the surviving contacts consuming themselves at a rate that left the commanding officer calculating in the margin between each update whether the remaining intercept sequence was going to complete before the remaining contacts reached the platform's outer safety boundary. It was not going to complete. The fourth SM-2 intercepted its assigned contact at 11:53 p.m. and 11 seconds. That left 2 contacts at 7.4 nautical miles from the platform and 49 seconds of flight time remaining. The SM-2 battery's reload cycle required 34 seconds between the 4th shot and readiness for a 5th. The Phalanx had an engagement range against a sea-skimming target that it would not achieve until the contacts were inside 1.5 nautical miles, which at their current speed was 9.8 seconds of flight time from the platform's hull. The gap between the SM-2 cycle completing and the contacts entering Phalanx range was not a gap that the destroyer's organic weapon systems could fill. The 2 surviving contacts covered 7.4 nautical miles in 49 seconds. The first surviving contact reached the platform's outer perimeter at 11:53 p.m. and 59 seconds. Its terminal seeker, an active radar system in the missile's nose that had been acquiring the platform's radar cross-section since the contact was approximately 3 nautical miles out, made its final course correction in the last 800 meters of flight, adjusting the impact point toward the primary processing module's central structure. The correction was small. The processing module was a large target. The terminal seeker did not need precision at this range. It needed arrival. The missile impacted the processing module's eastern face at 11:54 p.m. and 3 seconds. The warhead detonated on contact. The processing module's eastern face absorbed the initial blast pressure, which was sufficient to destroy the module's outer structural panels and collapse the internal process pipe runs in the impact zone. The blast wave propagated outward through the module structure and into the adjacent separator vessel manifold, where residual hydrocarbon vapor in the low-pressure section of the system ignited in the overpressure environment. The secondary fire developed rapidly, fed by the hydrocarbon inventory in the separator vessels and the platform's instrument air system, which had lost its isolation capability when the blast wave destroyed the primary control panel in the impact zone. The gas flare, which had been burning at the top of its stack throughout, was now competing with a secondary fire that was substantially larger and substantially less controlled than the facility's safety systems had been designed to manage. The offshore installation manager, in the accommodation module with the muster count still incomplete at 61 of 87, confirmed, activated the platform's emergency shutdown system, and simultaneously transmitted a mayday on the international distress frequency. The Phalanx engaged the second surviving contact at 11:54 p.m. and 6 seconds, 3 seconds after the first impact. The engagement occurred at 1.1 nautical miles from the platform's main deck. The rotary cannon's burst lasted 2.1 seconds. The contact's airframe fragmented under the impact of the penetrator rounds and the remaining fragments. A dispersed collection of airframe structure and intact warhead components that had survived the physical destruction of the missile's body impacted the platform's northwest leg and the associated riser pipe bundle at reduced velocity, the kinetic energy attenuated by the Phalanx engagement but not eliminated. The intact warhead component did not detonate on the secondary impact. The detonation system required a sensor input sequence that the warhead's electronics could no longer generate after the Phalanx fragmentation. The warhead was a dud in the physical sense, present, intact, embedded in the riser pipe bundle clamp structure, radiating no thermal or electronic output that distinguished it from the surrounding debris. Nobody on the platform knew, for 47 minutes after the engagement, that the second warhead had not detonated. The destroyer was repositioning toward the platform at 11:54 p.m., its helicopter already turning west to support the damage assessment and any personnel recovery requirement that developed. The commanding officer had a damage report request transmitting to the CAOC and a message to the platform's emergency frequency asking for status and personnel count. The platform's response, when it came at 11:55 p.m., was partial. The offshore installation manager confirmed the primary fire in the processing module, stated that the muster was incomplete at 61 confirmed in the accommodation modules, and requested immediate fire support and medical assistance. 26 people unaccounted for at 11:55 p.m. somewhere on a burning platform in the northern Persian Gulf. The damage control team from the destroyer embarked the Seahawk at 11:57 p.m. 4 personnel, firefighting equipment, medical supplies, the specific capability that an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer's crew maintained for exactly this kind of contingency in exactly this kind of threat environment. The Seahawk reached the platform at 12:02 a.m. The fire control officer aboard looked out the aircraft's cabin door at the platform's processing module and communicated his observation to the destroyer in language that was professional, accurate, and required no elaboration. The eastern face of the processing module was not present in any structural sense. The fire in the separator vessel area was substantial and self-sustaining. The northwest leg and riser bundle showed visible impact damage. The gas flare was continuing to burn normally on its stack above a facility that was simultaneously burning in a way that no safety system on its design had been intended to contain. The boarding party reached the platform's main deck at 12:04 a.m. The search for the 26 unaccounted personnel was systematic and conducted in the compressed urgency of people who understood that the secondary fire's development rate was consuming the window in which they could operate on exposed deck areas without respiratory protection becoming a limiting factor. They found 16 personnel sheltering in the platform's utility service module, a non-blast-rated structure on the platform's eastern side that had been the nearest available cover when the first missile hit, and that had survived the blast wave in sufficient structural condition to have provided meaningful protection. They found 7 personnel in the crane operator's cab on the platform's southern end, having taken refuge there when the primary alarms activated before they could reach the accommodation modules. That was 23 found, 61 confirmed earlier, 84 total. 3 personnel were in the processing module's control annex when the first missile impacted the eastern face. The control annex was structurally adjacent to the impact zone. The boarding party's team leader reached the control annex access hatch at 12:09 a.m. and found it structurally compromised. The blast pressure from the primary impact had deformed the hatch frame sufficiently to prevent normal operation. He transmitted the status to the Seahawk and requested the destroyer's second helicopter, which was configuring for launch with additional cutting equipment. While the second Seahawk was en route, the team leader and his partner worked the hatch manually with the tools they had, applying the specific combination of physical effort and technical knowledge that damage control training produces in people who have practiced exactly this problem on training structures designed to fail in exactly these ways. They had the hatch open at 12:13 a.m. All 3 personnel in the control annex were located. All 3 were in conditions that required immediate medical attention. All 3 were evacuated to the first Seahawk by 12:19 a.m. The evacuation was conducted in the presence of smoke from the secondary fire that had migrated from the separator vessel area into the platform's lower deck ventilation system, requiring each evacuation team member to manage their own respiratory exposure while simultaneously managing the evacuation of individuals who could not manage their own. It was the kind of operational requirement that has no clean solution and was resolved through the specific combination of training, physical capability, and focused determination that damage control doctrine relies on and that no training can fully replicate under the actual conditions. The second warhead was discovered at 12:31 a.m. by the second damage control team conducting a systematic sweep of the northwest leg and riser bundle area. The team leader identified the component as an intact warhead assembly, specifically a penetrating warhead section consistent with the cruise missile type that had been engaged, lodged between 2 riser clamp assemblies at the bundle's upper connection point, approximately 6 meters above the platform's main deck. He transmitted the discovery to the destroyer at 12:31 a.m. and 38 seconds in the flat, factual language that the situation required, and then he and his partner maintained their position near the component and did not touch it, because the doctrine for unexploded ordnance discovery on a structure that was simultaneously experiencing an active secondary fire did not have a resolution that involved touching the component. The explosive ordnance disposal team was aboard the third helicopter that launched from the destroyer at 12:36 a.m. They reached the platform at 12:44 a.m. and had the warhead component assessed, secured against movement, and declared render safe at 1:17 a.m., An hour and 23 minutes after the engagement that put it there, the platform fire was brought under control at 2:44 a.m. through the combined efforts of the platform's own emergency systems, which had survived the blast in sufficient condition to continue functioning in the undamaged areas, and the portable equipment deployed by the damage control teams from the destroyer. The fire had consumed the processing module's eastern section entirely and had damaged the separator vessel manifold to a degree that the platform manager, in his preliminary assessment at 3:15 a.m., characterized as requiring a complete replacement of the affected equipment and a minimum of 90 days of repair work before the facility could resume production. 90 days. 70,000 barrels per day. The economic arithmetic of what had been accomplished by 6 cruise missiles, of which 5 had been engaged, 1 had partially penetrated the Phalanx defense, and 1 had detonated on a primary structure. All 87 platform personnel were accounted for by 12:25 a.m. 3 individuals required medical evacuation to a shore facility. The remaining 84 were evacuated to the destroyer by 2 a.m. as the fire control operations entered their sustained phase. The destroyer's medical officer treated 11 additional individuals for smoke inhalation and minor blast-related injuries in the 40 minutes following the main evacuation. No personnel fatalities. The after-action assessment at the CAOC began at 4 a.m. and ran for 4 hours. The missile characterization, conducted from Seahawk targeting pod imagery of the impact site and the unexploded warhead component recovered from the riser bundle, established the cruise missile type as an Iranian-manufactured C-802 derivative in an extended-range configuration that had not been previously documented in the operational threat file at this engagement range from the nearest assessed Iranian coastal launch site. The range extension implied either a modified fuel system or a lighter warhead payload than the standard configuration, and the intelligence community would spend the following 2 weeks determining which. The launch site, was characterized from signals intelligence as a mobile coastal battery that had fired and repositioned within 8 minutes of the salvo launch. Satellite surveillance had a track on the vehicle movement corridor but not a confirmed precise location. A second attempt to confirm the battery's position was ongoing at the time the assessment concluded. The 2-missile penetration of the destroyer's organic defense represented the specific operational problem that a single-ship escort facing a 6-missile salvo was always going to present, and the assessment documented it with the clinical precision that allowed it to be useful rather than merely accurate. The SM-2 battery had performed within its design parameters. The Phalanx had performed within its design parameters. The gap between what the available systems could engage in the available time and the total salvo size was not a system failure. It was a capacity problem, and capacity problems in missile defense had a specific solution set that involved additional assets, layered coverage, and the kind of standing multi-ship escort geometry that a single destroyer operating in a threat environment of this demonstrated capability level was not, by itself, sufficient to provide. The assessment noted this finding. It noted it in the language of professionals who understood that operational recommendations and resource allocation decisions existed above their pay grade, and who documented the finding anyway, because that was what the process required and because the finding was true, regardless of what would be done about it. The Persian Gulf at 5 a.m. was the same water it always was. Flat, warm, and carrying its hydrocarbon smell across the surface toward the tanker traffic that had resumed its transit pattern in the southern sector after the engagement area emergency exclusion zone was established. The platform's flare stack was still burning. It would burn for a long time. The eastern processing module was a frame of steel and ash above the waterline, still cooling. The 3 personnel who had been in the control annex when the missile hit were on a medical transport en route to a shore facility. They had been found and extracted from a room that the blast had tried to seal permanently. They were on their way out of it because 4 people from a destroyer had flown a helicopter to a burning platform and worked a deformed hatch until it opened. That is the accounting that the numbers cannot fully capture. 87 personnel. 87 accounted for. The difference between those 2 numbers and a different number was 23 minutes of searching, a deformed hatch, and the specific professionalism of people who do not stop when the structure they are standing on is on fire. The line in the Persian Gulf is not a naval concept. It is a human one. It runs through every burning deck and every jammed hatch and every second of a damage control evolution where the decision to continue is made again because it was made before and will be made again, until the job is done, and the count reads the same number it started with, 87. The same number in the morning as it was before midnight. That is the mission. That is the answer.